I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And at the 2024 Oscars this year, Cord Jefferson, the writer and director of the movie American Fiction, said in his acceptance speech for Best Adapted Screenplay, quote, "I understand that this is a risk-averse industry, but $200 million movies are also a risk. Instead of making one $200 million movie, try making 20 $10 million movies or 50 $4 million movies," end quote. Independent filmmaking is in a state of flux, perhaps even a crisis. Our guest this week shares the wisdom she's gained from speaking with hundreds of her fellow filmmakers, along with what she's learned making her own movies. Liz Manashil is a feature film writer and director, a distribution consultant for independent films, and the co-host of Making Movies is Hard, a podcast about the trials and tribulations of independent filmmaking. Liz, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for letting me be here and for that beautiful intro.
Well, I'm glad that we're both glad that you're here. Now, on a recent episode of NPR's Weekend Edition about the Sundance Film Festival, new director Sean Wang said, quote, "It seems like the industry is in a very uncertain place, not just in terms of sales and acquisitions. You know, you hear every other day that all these studios are letting go of hundreds and hundreds of people. You know, new heads come on. They're having to reimagine their whole infrastructure, and it's a big question mark," end quote. And in that same interview, director Jane Schronbrun said, quote, "Independent film in America becomes more about training people to become Marvel directors and less about creating a viable alternative where more radical visions can be seen and appreciated," end quote. You worked for the Sundance Institute as the manager of their creative distribution initiative. You currently do freelance distribution consulting, and you and your podcast co-host Ulrich Purcell speak each week with filmmakers striving to get micro and low-budget movies made. So my question to you, Liz, to start us off is, what's the state of independent movie making today?
It's bad, the state of independent movie making and distribution. My vantage point is clearest through the eyes of a producer's rep and distribution. And a producer's rep is someone who basically joins a film team when they're about to release their movie and helps them find distributors. But I also, as you mentioned, I'm a writer, director, producer myself, trying to get projects off the ground and mainly work in the low budget space. So I guess I wanted to just start off with the caveat that I don't think things are ever easy for low budget creators in this American Hollywood-centric entertainment industry. But what's the state of independent film? Was that the question, Mike?
Yes. And for our listeners, maybe this will probably add some context. Liz and I know each other. We went to film school together 15, 16 years ago. You're right that making a low-budget movie has always been difficult, from the days of John Cassavetes in 1959 with Shadows up until today. But it feels like with our focus on $200 million films, the landscape today is much different from what it was in the 90s when you were a kid growing up having dreams of being a filmmaker yourself. It feels like our focus is on $200 to $300 million blockbusters and less on creating environments for new talent to come up and make their own way.
It's a very fair evaluation. I don't disagree, but I do think I live in a pocket of the industry where it's entrepreneurial filmmakers who aren't looking for permission. They're just going to make their content no matter what. But the real dismal picture that I see is how those films are received and whether those independent filmmakers, producers, production companies make a living doing what they do. So the state, I agree, we are, as a society, we're pointing major resources towards tentpole films, toward Marvel films, to superhero. You know, before that, it was like vampire, supernatural. I mean, these things come in cycles, but independent creators are still creating original content. They're just not being supported by the industry at large. But I do want to acknowledge that it shouldn't be our expectation for the industry to support us. It's our burden and our opportunity as independent filmmakers to force our way into, I don't know, the eyeballs of our audiences and to grab their attention. So there's a different perspective that I have.
Ulrich began the Making Movies is Hard podcast all the way back in 2015, and you joined the show as a full-time co-host in September of 2019. Every filmmaker's path to getting their first feature made has its own unique elements, but over the last almost 5 years of interviewing independent filmmakers week after week, Have you found any through lines, any similarities in their journeys at various stages of the process from development to distribution that you can speak to?
Yeah, but for me, it's an emotional one. I feel like my journey as a creator, as a writer director, is very often grappling with things like lack of confidence or imposter syndrome. And what I've learned from doing the podcast is these people that I look to, I see their career, I see what they've done, I see what they've accomplished, and I'm incredibly impressed by them. They never feel like they've done enough. So the through line for me is that every single person that we interview implies or answers that making movies is hard. Some people are tongue in cheek about it, and they'll say, well, it's not like brain surgery or rocket scientists. We're really lucky to be artists. But many people acknowledge that what we've chosen to do is very difficult in terms of being commercially successful at it. But the takeaway that I often most enjoy is the fact that I'm not alone in feeling so unaccomplished, and that like artists in general seem to be unsatisfied, and that's normal.
Why do you think that imposter syndrome is so common among creatives? It often feels like the biggest obstacle in our way to achieving our goals is ourselves.
Yeah, I wish I could tell you I don't do enough soul searching. I'm a little bit masochistic about my own imposter syndrome. I just revel in it. I just wash myself in it every day instead of philosophizing about it. And I'm listening to Aparna Nancherla's book on imposter syndrome right now. She's one of my favorite comedians, and she's trying to tackle it from a clinical perspective, which is also beyond me. But why do we have it? Why do we get it? I think we're in a very squishy industry where there's no objective evaluation of quality. You can get a reviewer, you can get fans, you could get followers, but who knows why they're watching your work or why they're following you or why they're listening to you. And you can't put a movie through a factory and they say grade A through all these checks and balances. You get an A+, you pass the test. It's so squishy that I think it's very hard to feel confident, A. And B is, the way I see it is that there's just constant rejections everywhere you go as an artist. I just today got a pass from an actress that we'd gone out to. Sorry, a pass just means like the actress doesn't want to do our movie. I couldn't see it just as one actress saying no to this one movie. It was very difficult for me not to see it as a global rejection on behalf of the entire industry, on me as a whole. Because when you're making art and it's personal, it feels like a personal rejection with every single thing you stick your neck out for.
I relate to that even with this podcast. And I know that it's totally nonsensical, right? You said just a second ago that you wash yourself in your imposter syndrome, you revel in it. And I think to people who either aren't in creative industries or maybe don't experience imposter syndrome to that sort of degree, that can almost sound like nonsensical. Like, why would you wash yourself in something that you know is toxic for you? But I think it's involuntary. I've definitely sent out really thoughtful invites to potential guests for shows. And I'm like, I've been studying them for a while, and I think like I've really cracked the code on an interesting aspect of their career or their life that I haven't heard them talk directly about in their podcast, but I think I've gotten at something beneath what they're saying. And I put this really thoughtful pitch together, and then I either don't hear anything or they get back to me and they just write a polite, I'm not interested. And it's really difficult not to take that personally, even though at the heart of it, it is legitimately not personal because they don't know you. You're a stranger, and there are thousands of reasons why they might decide to pass on something, anything from a movie, which can be a weeks or months long commitment, to something as simple as a 90-minute commitment for a podcast. And it could just be, in my case, like, I'd rather take a nap or spend 90 minutes just watching paint dry. And that's their life. And it's totally within their purview to do what they want. And I know that intellectually, but on a personal level, it still hurts.
I think a part of it, and I'm sorry it hurts. I wanted to acknowledge that.
Oh, no problem. I put that out there to relate to you.
Yeah. A part of that, just hearing what you're saying, is just a general argument, is that people in our industry, in the entertainment industry, or at probably most industries, receive pitch emails. I mean, I don't know what other industries are like. They receive them all the time. Similarly, I co-host a podcast and I receive emails from publicists. And a lot of them, I'm going to just say, are just total bullshit. They're just like, really overstating the success of a film or really trying to pump it up and sell it to me. My eyes glaze over as I read them, and I know there's no real heart going into it. And so I think when you have someone like you who puts like a very genuine effort into the world, it could be missed very easily because it's ruined by all of the like filler crap that people receive.
Right. Signal and noise.
Right. And so I think the argument could be also for, I'm not going to say it's for me as well, but for other people who get rejections, they may be getting rejections because other people are just not paying attention. They're not paying close attention to what you're trying to say.
Speaking of rejection, in that September 2nd, 2019 episode, which was your first full-time co-host role for Making Movies is Hard, you said, quote, "If I've been rejected by a film festival twice with both of my features, I've now decided never to apply to them again. It's proof that they don't like me," end quote. My question is now, 5 years later, just speaking of how like it can feel really personal, even though it probably isn't, do you still feel that way in 2024? And what are your thoughts on film festivals and what their role is now? Are film festivals still necessary in a world full of streaming services and direct-to-digital distribution?
Wow, gosh, I can be really a lot, can't I?
I personally really appreciate that about you, Liz. Honestly, one of the great things about the podcast and why I recommend anyone who's interested in movie making give it a listen is because honestly, I think the best conversations about creativity and the work of being creative, you have to be vulnerable in order to actually get to something real. So the fact that you share something like that on the podcast, when I know that all of our peers are thinking it, it takes a lot to do it, but I think it's very helpful because I think it makes people feel less alone.
Thank you for saying that. I think I was talking about South by when I said that. South by has broken my heart many, many times. And that's South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. It's like one of those top 5 film festivals in North America. And for some reason, it's garnered this brand as being more approachable than Sundance or TIFF or Tribeca and cooler. And Lena Dunham was discovered there. So maybe other short women with navel-gazing content could be discovered there as well. Not thinking of anyone in particular, of course.
Well, now I'm going to have to put a photo of you in the show notes so people understand the relevance here.
No, I still apply to South by with every project. I think I was just feeling petty and spiteful in that moment. I do take it personally. I do feel like they're rejecting me. Part of that is that I'm not just a filmmaker submitting a film, but I've worked in artist support for independent film for the past, 10, 12, 15 years, a long time since film school. I've worked for distribution consultants. I've worked for impact distribution agencies. I worked for Sundance for 3 years. It's a big part of my identity is speaking at film festivals, at conferences, knowing independent filmmakers, knowing programmers. And I witness other people in similar positions to mine. I don't even know what to call me, but someone who traffics in the independent film world in many different ways. I see their projects take off when they submit to these film festivals. And so I start thinking like, wait, why isn't the nepotism working for me? Like, what is it about? Like, I thought that possibly the work and the nepotism might work for me at the end of the day, which is like a weird perspective. But South by is one of those things where like I've spoken at South by twice. I was like on their website. I was like the cover of their catalog. Like,
well, and for our audience too, I think the thing that can be really frustrating for those who haven't been to like a film festival before, either as a filmmaker or just as an audience member, to get rejected by one of these festivals, when you know, just based on objective feedback you've gotten from peers that you trust and colleagues who've watched your film, and then you get rejected, and then you go to that festival and you see some of the films that were accepted, that just on an objective level, what are the production values and storytelling qualities of these movies? There are some that make it that are just objectively worse. And so to see some of those movies that get into the festival and compare them to yours, even from like an egoless perspective, you're like, well, how did theirs get in and not mine? And I think that can really play mind games with someone.
Yeah. And I don't think we live in a meritocracy, right? So I don't think that the best movies get in. And I'm not claiming that my movie is the best movie, but I am always thinking strategically. So my job is to make the best movie I can, to make the most personal film that helps me achieve an emotional catharsis, because that actually is why I make films, is to kind of work things out. And then it also is to work relationships to try to hack the system for my own benefit and the benefit of my clients as a producer's rep, as a consultant. So yes, when I go to these festivals and I see nepotism at work, I'm like, well, why is my nepotism not working? Like, how do I hack the system in the appropriate way so that I can benefit from it too? And South by is a particularly, I hate the word trigger, but triggering festival for me because I just so desperately want to be in that club. But I will keep applying, even though they break my heart every single time.
You are someone who consults independent filmmakers who are looking for distribution, looking to get into these festivals, looking to get onto these streaming services, into theaters. What is the state of that? Are film festivals still as valuable as they were when you and I were in film school in the mid to late 2000s, in an era where digital distribution is ever more prevalent? And even some bigger filmmakers, people who have backgrounds in filmmaking and have star power, sometimes their films just go straight to streaming. They skip theaters entirely or were never in festivals to begin with. How relevant are film festivals to filmmakers today?
Depends on what state you're in terms of your career. So as a producer's rep, if I'm pitching a film to a distribution company and that film doesn't have a hard genre association, so I just mean it's like a real horror film, not like a hybrid horror film, but like a real horror, a real action, a real thriller, not a soft genre association. If it doesn't have cast or a genre that is really meaningful, then I lean on the curation of film festivals to say to distributors, look, this film passed the test. They were vetted by the gatekeepers and curators of these film festivals. And I'm using that data to relay to you that this could be popular with audiences. This could be a very successful title for you. So it's important in terms of being shorthand in sales, but I would say that that's not 100 film festivals, right? That's a small pocket of film festivals that are meaningful to me when I pitch. When it comes to just the general utility of film festivals, it's difficult because I think they're struggling. I think that's the headline, is that film festivals have a business model that doesn't work for them and it doesn't work for filmmakers either. So the screeners, the programmers are underpaid, understaffed. The film festivals are struggling. They end up curating a lot of popcorn, tentpole, big name cast films because they're trying to sell tickets so that they can curate and discover other independent films. But that takes up slots. That takes up opportunities. And then the filmmakers don't get any piece of the ticket sales very often, or very rarely get screening fees. So they're not motivated to attend. I would say there are too many film festivals.
So many.
Yeah, it's like go on Film Freeway, which is how you look for film festivals, is on a website called Film Freeway. And you search through, and I always make the joke because I'm a big Nathan Fielder fan.
Such a good show.
He created a film festival very easily. I think it was the East Los Angeles International Film Festival. And I always make that joke. There's so many film festivals that their existence doesn't really support the economy of independent film. And it's just noise. And those are a lark. You play them, you meet people. They're not going to have any meaningful impact on your career. But personally, I have met really important figures in my life at film festivals. So I'm not going to say that they don't have value if they don't have value in distribution. It's just not obvious. It's again squishy. It's like what you make of it is what you get of a film festival.
Yes. I mean, it seems like some of the best value that comes out of film festivals, even the smaller ones, are about the interpersonal social connections you can make while you're there, the kind of, glad handing that you can do in person that is much harder to do online when you're just sending cold emails out to people. But let's turn to your filmmaking career. On the Make Your Movie podcast, you said that growing up, you would have written in blood that you would be an actress as an adult. And then one day at 16, quote, I woke up and I had no desire to act anymore and only desire to be the director of films and theater and television and anything anyone would let me do. And my entire life has been trying to do that as much as possible, end quote. What happened at 16 that caused that switch from wanting to perform in front of the camera to wanting to work behind it?
I'm a control freak. I think that had something to do with I developed some pretty necessary control freak tendencies around that age. And some of it had to do with a falling out with my drama teacher at the time where I just felt really, really powerless. And I don't know if this is accurate, this is revisionist, but I think part of me just wanted to not feel so powerless, and I wanted to be the one making the decisions. And so that contributed to it. Just like a horrible year that year, and was looking for a sense of purpose. And I started taking film classes at the local community college when I was in high school. And I saw this one movie. It's called Stolen Kisses by Francois Truffaut. For some reason, I was just like hit over the head with this moment thinking this movie is inspiring me and I want to do that for someone else. So I think it was anxiety, depression, some social foibles that had happened, this drama teacher thing. I mean, it was teenage years, but it's funny. I don't go to therapy now, but I had a therapist for about a year who was very lovely. And I talked about it. I was like, why am I attracted to controlling a world that's so chaotic? Like, why are directors drawn to directing? And I think there's a lot to unpack for a lot of us to why we're drawn to this. And it has to do with personal control, I think.
You've mentioned directors Nicole Holofcener, Whit Stillman, Allison Anders, and Hal Hartley as some of the filmmakers who inspired you growing up in the 90s. What about their films, their style, their stories connected with you as a teen?
They weren't flashy. I mean, I feel like you and I, when we were at USC, everyone talked about Tarantino or George Lucas or Spielberg or just these kind of like very stylized, sometimes conventional filmmakers. And I never had those whims. I never was thinking, oh, I really want to do that cool shot. Or wouldn't it be great if we did this with the camera and then did the whip pan and the dolly? Like, those are natural, wonderful instincts. I'm not making fun of them. I don't know why I did that voice, but I never had that inclination. I always thought I want to replicate a moment that I had on film, or I want to see a relationship that I've had on the big screen, or a character that I never see who's like me on the big screen. And Nicole Holofcener with Walking and Talking, that main character is uncomfortable and anxious and is not a romantic success. And, Allison Anders has this wonderful, sweet pace to all her work. And Whit Stillman's films are very talky. So I was looking for references that implied not overly stylized and dialogue-based storytelling.
I feel like I can see a straight line from Holofcener's Walking and Talking to your two feature films, Bread and Butter and Speed of Life. Those awkward moments of silence, the things we want to say so badly that are left unsaid.
Thank you. That's so nice.
With that dream of being a writer-director, you pursued film and media studies as an undergraduate at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. But at that time, you were, quote, paralyzed, unable to really make content, end quote. I relate to that a lot. But what was causing the dissonance between what you envisioned as your life's true calling and the lack of action you were able to take to pursue it during that period?
I didn't learn this about myself until recently, but I think I'm a perfectionist, which is so weird. Like, I just learned to floss like 2 weeks ago. I'm not even kidding. Like, I'm not a typical perfectionist. Like, I'm not clean or organized. Like, it's not about that for me, but I put a lot of pressure on things being good enough and being the right type of good. And so when I was at college, I even had a video camera with me, but I was pretty paralyzed by the dream, the exalted dream of making movies and the execution, and just really not knowing how to even start, not knowing how to turn on the camera, not knowing how to edit, because back then it was tape. It wasn't your computer, and you had to find equipment. You had to find resources. That was all so overwhelming to me. And so I went to WashU because I did an exhaustive search of every single school in the country. I created a Word document and I went through every single school, and I would delete them for various reasons. If they didn't have a film program, I deleted them. If they didn't do this, if they didn't do that. And I went to WashU not realizing that they had a film program, but not a film department. And they only had 2 production classes in the entire program. And it wasn't until I got to USC Film School and met Michael Callahan that I was given the structure and the permission and the feeling of safety to try. And I didn't have that at WashU. I didn't have the infrastructure I needed to experiment and feel safe at all.
You said in one interview that in grad school, you were basically forced into making short films. And then that was the first time you felt proud of something that you had made. I don't remember who said it, but there was someone who said that they didn't have a fear of failure. They had a fear of success. I relate to that a lot because if you're actually successful at something, well, then all eyes are on you to live up to what you've accomplished. And then what happens? Because then if you fail after you've been successful, it's almost a worse pain than having never tried at all. I also relate to this idea of being dual-minded, of having to play one part of your mind against the other, having to try and navigate your brain's booby traps and anxieties. My big thing is anxiety-induced procrastination. I'll delay starting something I'm excited about because I'm worried that it won't be any good. And then I hate myself because I never end up doing it. So I have to find ways to navigate around that. Like I'll set irrevocable public deadlines for myself that my colleagues and loved ones are aware of so that if I don't go through with my stated goals, I'll have to suffer the shame publicly. Do you ever find yourself having to navigate around your own anxieties?
Oh, shame and me are best friends. Absolutely. that is how I get anything done is through shame. I always say this, and I hope it doesn't come across that I think I have an audience or a fandom or anything like that, but I do try to live my life in public for some reason because I think it puts a weird pressure on me to get things done. So I announce things a lot. What I'm acknowledging is no one's listening, but it makes me feel pressure and shame that I utilize to my own advantage by saying these things out loud. Whenever I want to do a project, I announce it. I put it on Facebook. I started documenting the creation of this third feature about a year ago on Patreon, to hold myself accountable so that I would have to deliver progress to a group of people every week.
For our audience, this is your horror comedy Best Friends Forever?
Yes. So I'm asking for $1 a month from people so they could witness the painful process of getting a feature film off the ground. People are very kindly supported me in that way. But I did it out of a feeling of necessity that I wanted to hold myself accountable. I have similar anxieties. I think mine function in different ways than yours. I think the procrastination anxiety for me applies in more personal ways than career ways. Because for career, I find myself making very foolhardy, impulsive decisions as a way to just keep like flailing about in this industry. I don't overthink a lot of things because I'm scrambling to create a career. So I would say I make more bad decisions than good sometimes in the effort to be productive and to keep my name out in an attempt to be in the public sphere.
As one former film student to another, now in 2024, in an age of 4K smartphone cameras, online filmmaking tutorials, and YouTube and Vimeo self-distribution, do you think that film school is still a good deal for aspiring filmmakers?
No, I think it was a really important thing for me socially. You know, I listened to the podcast that you did, Michael, with, I'm just going to call it the sex podcast. The podcast you did about
Christine Emba. Yeah.
And just you talking a little bit about being a late bloomer. And I think I didn't really come out of my social shell until I got to grad school at USC. And so for me, it wasn't about learning filmmaking being at USC. It was actually learning how to feel comfortable in my own skin, how to correspond with people in a new way, how to become independent, dating, like all these things that I hadn't done before. That was how grad school functioned for me. But in terms of teaching me filmmaking, no. And in terms of being worth the amount of money they charge, no. And now that we've graduated, I always presumed there would be much more of a lifeline from the school to alumni, and it's non-existent. The most important thing I got out of film school were friendship and relationships. And I think you can do that by making shorts, by getting on sets and building your own network. I don't think you need to pay the amount of money that most grad schools charge.
Speaking of sex and late blooming, these are topics at the forefront of your first film, 2015's Bread and Butter, which was a micro-budget feature. For our audience, what is a micro-budget feature?
People define it in different ways. I always look at SAG-AFTRA has these different tiers, and anything under $300,000 is called ultra low budget agreement. And that's usually what I use as the threshold. So both of my features, Bread and Butter included, were made for about $100,000. So well below that. But you could end up talking to another filmmaker who would say that that is a massive amount of money to work with, that it's not micro budget at all. And that micro budget is $7,000, $10,000.
For people who aren't familiar with the filmmaking process, when they hear $100,000, I think that's twice as much as the average American makes in a year. So it sounds like a lot of money. I know from personal experience, having worked on a lot of film sets, that it is barely any money. So for context, what would a $100,000 budget go towards? And why is it so little in the grand scope of making a movie?
In filmmaking, you pay for everything. And you can make lower budget films if you get donated elements. So in LA, a low budget location that you would rent for a day is $1,000. And that's like old data. That's data from several years ago. So I don't know what it would be now. And that would be, again, low budget rates. The average indie film is somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks. You get weekends off, but maybe it's 15 to 22 days. So think about just that. So $15,000 on the low end for locations. You take that out of your $100,000, you have $85,000 to deal with for props, for set deck, for labor, for crafty, for catering, for transportation, for gas, for your contingency unless something goes wrong, for your camera package, for your lighting equipment, for wardrobe, for makeup. Oh my gosh, all these things are coming to mind. I didn't even plan to say all this. They're just erupting out of me. Those things cost a lot of money. And then I've worked mainly under a concept called most favored nations. So that means everyone gets the same rate. Most favored nation for cast, usually they get a certain amount of money per day. Usually with me, that's scale. So that's like the least amount that an actor can get, unfortunately, because I'm low budget. I digress. My point was that if you don't work in most favored nations, many actors expect something called Schedule F, or they expect a publicity fee that could be tens of thousands of dollars. That's a little bit under the table money to be brought onto a project if they bring commercial value to your film. It gets so expensive to make movies, and the only way to make it on a small budget is if people donate locations, time, and just don't get taken advantage of when they do that.
Bread and Butter, as I said, was your very first film, but it co-starred Saturday Night Live's Bobby Moynihan, and your second film, Speed of Life, co-starred Ann Dowd, who's been in HBO's The Leftovers and major movies like Hereditary and Garden State. How do you go about, as an independent filmmaker working with small budgets, getting big names?
Until this most recent feature that I'm doing right now, I've cast all my projects myself. And I've always attributed any success I've had to the fact that I'm not playing any games. I go to the agent with a deal memo written up by my lawyer/producer who gives me quite a sweet deal on these templates. And I say, I'm the director, I'm the writer, your client's the number one choice. We're not talking to anyone else. Here's exactly why I want to work with them, and here are all my cards on the table. It doesn't always work. I've been rejected gazillions, quadrillions of times, but sometimes it appeals to an actress. So Ann Dowd, we somehow got to her through a friend of mine who knew her representation. Her reps were open to reading the script. She liked the script. And then one day her reps called me and they said, she likes it. Handmaid's Tale just got extended for a new season. If you wait 8 months, she'll do it. And I was like, no brainer. We'll wait 8 months. And then everyone else on that cast pretty much said yes to work with Ann Dowd. So I think that there's a strategy, there's a sincerity, And then you have to be patient. You have to be able to pivot. You have to be able to abide by the whims of the industry. You can't really go in being demanding and entitled. You just have to keep on knocking down those doors and see who's willing to play ball with you.
You drew a really beautiful performance out of Anne. How do you go about working with actors? What's your process? Because every director's process of working with actors is so different. I mean, George Lucas famously, he'll just say faster or more intensity to his actors and then kind of leave them to fend for themselves. While the director of Blue Valentine had co-stars Ryan Gosling and Michelle Williams live together in a rented home as their married working class characters. They even bought groceries with a budget based on their characters' incomes, staged arguments without the director even present, and filmed home movies. So what is your process in working with actors both before you're ready to film and during the filmmaking process itself?
I don't feel like I've really afforded myself the opportunity to have a process, to be super candid with you. I spend so much time hustling to get the project off the ground and to make it happen. And not just me, I don't mean to take credit for this. I have amazing producers and crew members who are instrumental in getting these projects off the ground. But very often I'll take on a lot of producerial duties because I'm not paying my producers what they deserve. So I spend so much time trying to get the projects off the ground that I'm not really affording myself the space to work as an artist or creative. So with Anne, we had one phone call before she came to set. I just told her what I wanted the movie to feel like, what was important to me. She told me some personal stories about her life and what she's going to be drawing from when the character goes through something emotional. I said, that's amazing. Thank you. I never use that information to manipulate her. I just take it in. I know where she's going when she's going to a place where she has to cry on camera or go through something really emotional. I just was really lucky. I didn't really meet Anne before we cast her, and we were just incredibly fortunate to be able to work with her. But on Bread and Butter, my first feature, I had a meeting with the lead actress, Christine Weatherup, whom I know you know Chrissy very well.
She's great.
She's amazing. And she graphed out the emotional trajectory of her character. And that was the most amount of work I've ever done with an actress or an actor before a performance. And I still think of it as truly ideal in a micro-budget world when you don't get to rehearse very much. And so she would just say, where am I in this scene? And she would just visually graph where she was and needed to be so that when we shot out of chronology, she could go back to that graph and say, I'm at an 8 here and I need to go to a 10 tomorrow. So I'm going to temper it a little bit. But I don't have a process working with actors. I wish I did. And this past year, I took an improv class because I thought I got to put myself in the hot seat to remind myself how scary it is to be an actor so that I can be even more sensitive to them on set. I feel like very often I'm rushing actors because of low budget speeds. And then I really want to work with an acting coach to help just make sure I've really refined objectives for all the characters for my next feature. And that's, I think, the best I can do, again, having to work at a breakneck speed in independent film.
Filmmaking is such a strange combination of being hyper proactive and also reactive all the time. Reactive to actors' schedules, reactive to the limited amount of time you might spend on any location, reactive to the fact that your budget isn't as big as you thought it was going to be, or it was going to be bigger, but then a week before production started, it gets sliced in half. I've heard all kinds of horror stories, and it seems like one of the things that kind of unifies great directors is their ability to, and I think a lot of this comes from just being really prepped beforehand, is about reacting to things as they happen to you and then adapting to them accordingly.
I'm a big David Lynch fan. I don't think I'm going to get this story right, but I'll try. He just uses mistakes or accidents in his work. There was a scene in Twin Peaks where I think there was a flashing or a fluctuating fluorescent light. And someone offered to fix it. And he said, no, we're keeping it, right? It's adding to the scene. We're going to utilize it. Reactivity is important. I do think that on an indie film set, it's 90% casting for me. I mean, I don't really have a lot of time to make adjustments. I'd say the only example of successful pivoting on Speed of Life is there was a scene toward the end of the shoot where Anne and I were talking about it. And she basically implied that it was overwritten and it'd be much more graceful and impactful if it was simplified. We sat down, we cut half the lines, and we got to the core of the scene, and we printed out new sides and gave them to everyone, and we did it. And it made the film stronger. Being a writer-director, you have a lot more freedom to be able to do that kind of thing. I mean, had I not written the content, it would have been a lot harder to get the buy-in of the writer to make that kind of last-minute decision.
Both of your features have a very slice of life quality that I really enjoy. I mean, I just find myself biased towards movies like that. Your dialogue is so conversational, and your characters' lives and their problems are often small. And I don't mean that as a dig. I just mean there's not like a blue light coming from the sky that's about to bring aliens to Earth and they have to fight off the aliens to save humanity. I like it because my problems are small. I think most of our problems compared to world politics are relatively small. I like to describe my short films back when I was making them as like emotionally autobiographical. The actual events didn't happen explicitly to me, but the films are trying to get at something that is emotionally true to my life and things that have happened to me. Something I've either felt or thought a lot about, something I'm working through maybe. How much of your films are based on your own life and experiences?
God, I love that. I love what you just said. And it is very, very true for me. Every single thing I've done as a writer, director has been very much emotionally autobiographical. My first feature is about dating for the first time in grad school and over romanticizing the wrong things because I had been raised on rom-coms or novels with romantic subplots. Speed of Life is about someone I couldn't get over and me working through that. You know, the character who disappears for 24 years because he fell in a wormhole is a metaphor for a breakup. And Anne Dowd's inability to get over it was my inability to get over, you know, a short fling that I had with someone. And this upcoming film, Best Friends Forever, is about intimacy and friendship. And when the pandemic happened, and when we started having children, me and my husband, friendship suffered dramatically. In my film, it's a horror comedy where all the friends end up killing each other.
Spoilers.
I mean, I like to give away that ending because I think the purpose of it is not to see who survives. The core relationship of the film is a thawing of two friends who had been distanced for 10 years and they come back together and they become best friends. That's what I'm after right now, as I'm really trying to find and I'm struggling with platonic intimacy. After I made Speed of Life, I wasn't haunted by that past relationship anymore. And after I made Bread and Butter, the people I made the film about actually came to me and they kind of gave me their blessing. And they were like, oh, I really like what you did there. So it's like really, really expensive therapy, but I can't stop. I'm like addicted to it.
I once described my short films as emotional exorcisms, so I totally relate. Speaking of Bread and Butter, it was really novel in a good way to see a female protagonist do something that we usually see men in these films do, which is project an imagined ideal onto a flawed human being. And then I kind of just want to share some observations I had from watching both of your films in the context of prepping for this interview. With Bread and Butter specifically, although there were some themes that were similar in both movies, it was characters who just live in fear of taking action, which kind of calls back to something you said about your own life. We watch the characters think a lot about doing things, think before they speak, hesitating, characters who watch each other from afar, read about each other in book notes, watch each other's YouTube videos, leave messages for their friends and family on videotapes. And across both of your movies, both Bread and Butter and Speed of Life, both films feature characters that kind of exist within liminal spaces. They're waiting for something to happen to them or for something to change.
Wow. Thank you. as you were talking, I was like, I need to send Michael flowers or cookies for even just like watching the movies and saying such amazing things about them. It's true. I think without even trying, those weren't purposeful efforts, but they came out of me because I do feel like I have a headspace that reflects everything you just said. Liminal spaces, there's a moment in Speed of Life where there's a bird trapped between two floors. That was purposeful. That is an allegorical moment that I tried to create there. But I think very often my anxiety paralyzes me from taking action in my personal life. And then I kind of just fester and obsess and overthink. And so my characters have very similar traits to me without, I hope, not being little multiplicity Michael Keaton versions of me. But I don't see a lot of characters who are neurotic outside of a like Woody Allen framework in a lot of films that I watch. And so I just want to create more movies that are relatable to people like me.
That's such a coincidence that you mentioned Woody Allen specifically, because I was just going to say that watching Chrissy in Bread and Butter felt like watching Owen Wilson play Woody Allen in Midnight in Paris.
I love that.
And I felt like there was something deeply relatable as a creative person watching Amelia in Bread and Butter. There's this quote that she has. She says, quote, "I never know where to look when I'm really close to someone physically. Like, do I use both of my eyes to focus in on one of theirs, or do I use both to look at each of their eyes?" End quote. She's this character who has trouble being present and getting out of her own head. She's constantly observing and obsessing over the tiniest details, quirks, and absurdities of society and human interaction that I think for most people kind of fade into the background. But for some of us, they just blare at us and we can't help but notice them, the kind of weird inconsistencies or quirks that don't really make sense. And I think that that's common in a lot of creative people, like this obsession and curiosity about the seemingly minor and often mundane details of life. And it was something I really related to.
Thank you. I mean, I didn't know Bread and Butter was a comedy really until we showed it to people and they laughed. And I was like, no, these are like my concerns in life. These characters inhabit my fears, my anxieties. And then I realized that that's part of the catharsis, right? It's like you put yourself in a movie, you put your fears, your anxieties, your joys, your loves into these characters. And then when you see other people respond to them, I'm not saying it diminishes the like weird anxieties that I have that are sometimes painful. That's the catharsis. People thinking it's funny and me learning not to take myself so seriously and exercising it. So I had a really hard time with eye contact. And then I realized that I was weird when people responded to it in the film. So a lot of what I do when I write is stream of consciousness, or just things flow out of me almost like a diary entry. You just cut out all the things that don't make sense anymore and you've got a story. And that's how I try to make things.
Just as one more quick aside about Speed of Life, I got quite a chuckle out of the fact that Bread and Butter exists as a film within the MCU, the Manashil cinematic universe. I liked that.
Thank you.
Yeah, although that also, in the same way that the Marvel Cinematic Universe creates some paradoxes, there is something paradoxical about Bread and Butter existing as a film from the past within Speed of Life, but then we also see Chrissy as a different character in the present.
And also my husband is in both, too.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Maybe he's a grandson or something of someone else. Before we wrap out, Liz, I'd love to turn to the idea of film criticism, because I think that plays a big role in the filmmaking process. You were the co-host of the PBS and Hulu show Just Seen It, which was a film and television review show. Was there anything specific that you learned about the filmmaking process when you were a film critic on that show? Because after you finished hosting it, you said, quote, "Ultimately, I did not have a good time being a film critic," end quote. Why not?
I remember I reviewed Pariah by Dee Rees, and I didn't like Pariah. We posted a review. It was me and an amazing critic named Leah Aldridge who talked about Pariah. And there were some things that I wasn't eloquent about in terms of me not liking the movie. And there were a lot of things that Leah was incredibly eloquent about in terms of her support of the film. And I still remember posting that review on YouTube and someone was like, SMH, shaking my head. Like another reviewer used to say this all the time. Why should I take a gun to a knife fight? Like, what's the point of me coming in and being critical of a film like Pariah, which made it in spite of all of these odds, a micro budget film from a new up and coming director with a very interesting voice? Like, what's the point of me publicly criticizing it, especially when indie films are in the state that they are, where they're just not making money and it's just very difficult for independent film creators. And it just felt like, who cares if I like something or if I don't like something or if it's effective or it isn't effective? Like, I don't want to be a part of talking about films in that way anymore. I'd rather just try to support creators and encourage them to get their work out in the world, because before I made my first feature, I felt like I was about to erupt. I just so desperately wanted to put something out into the world. And I love bread and butter more than so many things in life, but it's imperfect. It's not a perfect film. You know, what's the point? What's the point of criticism at my level? I'm not Pauline Kael, you know, I'm not Roger Ebert. I wasn't putting out a level of good into the world that I wanted to. So I'm going to leave that to other people to do and just try to empower creators to make instead of try to break them down.
Well, to provide some unsolicited defense of how you were on that show, you did note that some of your co-hosts, out of a fear of being too critical to any of the films featured, made you feel the need to compensate for that by being more critical than you might have been normally.
Yeah.
So I just want to put that on the record. You are a very positive person ordinarily.
Well, thank you.
But you did go on to say that we just need better film critics these days. You've rightly noted that a lot of film critique these days is just either I loved it or I hated it. We kind of exist at these two extremes of either it's the best thing ever or it's the worst thing and, you know, it should be nuked without providing any kind of constructive or productive feedback. So what would an ideal film criticism landscape look like to you?
Critics that have historical context for why they feel what they do. You know, I studied film studies at WashU. I ran a screening society at school. You know, I think I regularly watch films that aren't made in 2024, reading screenplays, knowing the historical context in which films are made and what they could be commenting on. I mean, I just think film critics, and there are a lot of really good ones out there, but a lot of film critics are just like in their basement, giving gut instincts, gut reactions to how they feel. And what would be helpful is if they just do a little bit of research to figure out why the film was made in that fashion.
I'd love to end with a quote from Speed of Life, in which one character says, "Time is running out. What if I don't become the person I'm supposed to be before it does?" So my final question for you is, Liz, looking at the landscape of your own life and career, who is the person you might not yet be, but want to become before time runs out?
I want to be the person that you have painted me out to be on this podcast. Like, I'd had a tough morning getting a pass from that actress. And if I could have more conversations like this, where I feel like all of the blood, sweat, and tears were put into art that made some sort of impact. And if I had more reminders of that, I mean, that's ego talking, but that sounds like a lovely identity to live within. What you do, what you've done the past hour for me has made me feel consequential, Michael. And I want to feel consequential. And I don't want to lose sight of that in future Liz.
Well, thank you. It has been a pleasure. I'll end with this. Based on some of my own personal experience and the experience of some of my peers and close friends, and from some of what you've shared today, I mean, I think the least we can say is that filmmaking is a tough, often brutal and unforgiving business. And so I'd like to say to you, Liz, that I appreciate the work you do to support your fellow filmmakers and getting their films distributed, in the work that you're doing as a co-host of the Making Movies is Hard podcast, which is such a resource for people who are looking to get into filmmaking or who often feel alone in their filmmaking journey, and your generosity. And I sincerely appreciate the vulnerability you put into your work and put into your films, because I can see it when I watch them and it really comes through, and I think it makes them special. So thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you. This was amazing.